My hope is that you will resist those bucketful of money. I think a lot of players, a lot of sponsors, a lot of charities, and frankly, the 9/11 families are hoping that the PGA Tour will stand up and frankly avoid the sellout that this deal seems to be.
So he wants the PGA to stand up to Saudi Arabia, while Congress won't. While Congress continues to allow weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, while Congress does nothing to push Saudi Arabia to end the blockade that is prohibiting food and fuel from getting into Yemen, while Congress continues to hold zero investigative hearings into Saudi Arabia's role in 9/11. Congress does nothing to address the core issues that we have with Saudi Arabia's historical and present use of violence. But a golf tour is getting shamed by members of Congress into taking a stand. The hypocrisy is stunning, if not at all surprising.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for tuning in to the 277th episode of the listener-supported Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. Now, Congressional Dish, if this is your first time checking it out, is a podcast about government, not politics. This podcast is about what happens in Congress after we elect people to represent us. This is a podcast about what they do with our money and in our names. And one of my favorite things about Congress, one of the things that actually got me interested in watching Congress in the first place, are the investigations that Congress is empowered to conduct. Now, some of their investigations affect our lives more than others. And the investigation we'll be talking about today is one of those that is probably going to affect your life in no way whatsoever. Because the investigation we'll be looking into today is the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Subcommittee on Permanent Investigations hearing about the agreement between the PGA and LIV golf tours, which is an agreement which surprised the sporting world when it was announced in mid-June. And if you don't like golf, if you think golf is a waste of land and water resources, and if you think that Robin Williams had a point about the sport being ridiculous,
here's my idea for a fucking sport. I knock a ball in a gopher hole.
Oh, you mean like pool?
Off pool! Not with a straight stick, with a little up stick. I whack the ball, it goes in a gopher hole.
Oh, you mean like croquet?
Croquet! I put the hole hundreds of yards away! Oh, yeah! It's great fun there! Oh, yeah, that's a great thing!
Oh, like a bowling thing?
No! Not straight, I put in the way! Like trees and bushes and high grass, so you can lose your fucking ball and go whacking away with a fucking tire iron. Whacking away, and each time you miss, you feel like you're gonna have a stroke. That's what we'll call it. A stroke, because every time you miss, you feel like you're gonna fucking die. Oh, great. Oh, and here's a bit of back. Oh, this is brilliant. Right near the end, I'll put a flat piece with a little flag to give you fucking hope. But then I'll put a pool and a sandbox to fuck with your ball again. You'll be there trashing your ass, jerking away in the sand.
Oh, and you do this one time?
No! 18 fucking times!
if you feel like the genius Robin Williams is correct in his representation of the reality of golf, then you might be tempted to turn off this episode. And I get it, because if that's how you feel about golf, I promise you that the host of this show is right there with you. Because my husband loves golf. He sets our money on fire playing it. He sends our weekends into extended naps by watching hours and hours and hours of it for like 4 days in a row. And I find it all mind-numbingly boring. And yet, I found this hearing fascinating for a lot of reasons. Because this isn't just a story about golf. This is a story about monopoly powers and competition in business. This is a story about labor rights, about employees versus independent contractors. This is a story about Saudi oil money and what they're choosing to do with it. This is a story about accountability for Saudi Arabia for their bad deeds, including 9/11 and their ongoing war on Yemen. And if you don't know much about that war on Yemen, I did a whole episode about it, years ago. And I put that episode in the show notes for you. It's really interesting stuff. But this is also a story about members of Congress turning their personal beefs into congressional investigations. And of course, it is a story about sports and their level of importance in this country. And so there was a lot here, but it was spread out over 3 hours, and it didn't need to take 3 hours. And so today, I'm going to give you highlights of the hearing that took place on July 11th about the PGA and LIV golf tours. And I'm going to do so in an order that tells the story from this hearing as I saw it. Because if you haven't watched a congressional hearing before, the hearings jump around from topic to topic the entire time. And unless you watch every minute of these hearings, you're going to miss stuff. They're hard to follow. Because the way they're structured is that members of Congress get 5 minutes to make speeches in the beginning of these hearings. And then the witnesses, they get their own 5-minute speeches. And then there are question and answer sessions with each member of the committee getting 5 minutes per round. And in this hearing, they actually had more than one round of questions. And it's very rare for members of Congress to follow up on the previous person's topic. And so what happens is they jump around from topic to topic as each new person gets to ask their questions. And so I rearrange things just to make the storylines easier to follow. But unfortunately, because of the way I did this, making long testimony mashups, because of this different structure, I've done it in a few episodes in the past, but this isn't how I normally do things. But because of this, I can't give you timestamps for each clip like I usually do. But the hearing was aired on C-SPAN and is available on cspan.org. And so I put the link to the full hearing in the show notes for you so that you can use the C-SPAN transcript search function to find these clips pretty easily. You can watch these comments in context, and then you can see for yourself if you trust my edits. But before we get to the hearing and those edits, I do want to remind you that this is a listener-supported podcast, because when I don't remind you of this in the beginning of the show, people don't pay, which is exactly what happened with the last episode. In the last episode, we ran a little experiment. I didn't say anything, and the money didn't come in. And so this is a listener-supported podcast. Please support it in whatever amount you believe is fair. And you can do that using the support page on congressionaldish.com. And by the way, if you don't like the golf swings that I put over, the bad words, and I know Robin Williams had a few of them, if that annoyed you, all you have to do is pay for this podcast. And we do have a feed available for you with no golf swings. The easiest way to get that is by signing up on Patreon, and you can choose whatever amount feels fair to you per episode. So, don't bitch at me about the golf swings, because you are empowered to get rid of them. But another thing we have to do before we get into those edits is I feel like you need a quick introduction into what this whole PGA LIV golf situation is all about. And so here's the backstory. Since the 1930s, live professional golfing events have been either owned or put on in partnership with the Professional Golfers Association of America, otherwise known as the PGA. But in 2022, the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia, which is a $700 billion fund, whose chairman is Saudi Arabian Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who's, the same prince who the CIA has medium to high confidence, ordered Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi's head to be chopped off in the Saudi Arabian consulate building in Istanbul, Turkey. So not the coolest of dudes. But the obscenely wealthy fund, controlled by that guy and other Saudi Arabian high-ranking people, They used their money to start a new professional golfing tour with team structures and loud music, very different vibes from the PGA, and they've called it LIV Golf. And the Saudis used their $700 billion public investment fund, otherwise known as PIF, to offer the most well-known professional golfers in the world crazy amounts of money to play for LIV. So, for example, Phil Mickelson was offered over $100 million to play for LIV Golf, an offer he took as it is more than he earned over the course of his entire career, winning over 50 tournaments on the PGA Tour. Then there's Tiger Woods. Tiger Woods was offered a mind-boggling $700 million to play for LIV. But that's an offer that he refused out of loyalty to the PGA Tour and objections to how the LIV events are structured. He's apparently not a big fan of the loud music. There were also many other golfers that were offered huge sums of money by the Saudis to play on the LIV Tour, but I don't know or care who they are. But you get the point. LIV was offering big bucks, and some professional golfers did say yes. And the PGA decided to punish the golfers who chose to play for the competing tour. The players were fined for playing in LIV tournaments after their requests to the PGA to be allowed to play for LIV were turned down. And then the PGA banned those players from also playing in PGA events, which then led to some antitrust lawsuits, including a lawsuit filed by Phil Mickelson and 10 other professional golfers, claiming, quote, "The purpose of this action is to strike down the PGA Tour's anti-competitive rules and practices that prevent these independent contractor golfers from playing when and where they choose," unquote. And the Department of Justice is also investigating the PGA Tour for anti-competitive behavior. Which is why it was such a surprise in June when an agreement was announced between the PGA and the Public Investment Fund, an agreement that was widely understood to be a merger between the PGA and LIV Golf. But this hearing made me understand the situation differently. And so let's get into it. So first up, here is the Democratic chairman of the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Subcommittee on Permanent Investigations, Senator Richard Blumenthal, a Democrat from Connecticut. Here he is explaining why he called this hearing to order.
Today's hearing is about much more than the game of golf. It's about how a brutal, repressive regime can buy influence, indeed even take over a cherished American institution to cleanse its public image. It's a regime that has reportedly killed journalists, jailed and tortured dissidents, fostered the war in Yemen, and supported other terrorist activities, including the 9/11 attack on our nation. Today is about sports washing. And we already know that they have purchased a British Premier League soccer team, two of the largest video game tournament operators in the world, and made investments in Formula One racing, among many other investments. The institutions that concern us today are vital to our national interests. To have them taken over by a repressive foreign regime certainly is a matter of our national security.
When you think of national security, do you think of golf? I just feel like this is a perfect example of how national security is a term that means nothing now and justifies everything, including this investigation, apparently. But let's get back to Chairman Blumenthal's opening statement.
For 2 years, the most vehement opposition to the Saudi government's taking over the sport of golf in America, and the most vehement criticisms of Saudi sports washing came from the PGA Tour leaders themselves. They enlisted fans, sponsors, the 9/11 family, members of Congress like myself. Some of those leaders sat across from me in Cromwell, Connecticut, and asked me to support them, and I did. All on the promise and commitment to maintaining the PGA Tour as an independent, cherished, iconic American institution. Understandably, there was a feeling of betrayal among many of the individuals and groups that supported the PGA Tour, including from the players themselves.
So before this hearing, Chairman Blumenthal was talking to the PGA about LIV Golf. And it sounds to me like it wasn't just the players who felt betrayed. It sounds to me like a certain committee chairman was also feeling betrayed because he had bought the PGA spin. And in the hearing, we got some information about how those conversations between Senator and PGA may have come about. Here's Senator Josh Hawley speaking to the Chief Operating Officer of the PGA, Ron Price.
Public reports say that you paid lobbyists last year in just one quarter of the year, 6 figures or more as to lobby Congress on the Saudi Golf League proposals. What was that related to?
Senator, we went to members of Congress as we faced a very threat to our existence to make them aware of what the Public Investment Fund was attempting to do through its operations of the LIV Golf Series.
And so make Congress aware and ask for what? What did you want this body to do?
Senator, anything that the Congress could do within its power to help preserve an American institution.
Chairman Blumenthal and the PGA are even using the exact same talking points. Did you catch how the Chief Operating Officer of the PGA and Chairman Blumenthal both called the PGA an American institution? Who talks like that, other than people that are using the same talking points memos? And so clearly Chairman Blumenthal, by his own admission, was on Team PGA in their battle against the LIV Golf Tour. And his statements seem to indicate, at least to me, that he is included in the group of people who feel personally betrayed by the PGA's deal with the LIV Golf Tour. And so with that in mind, let's get back to his opening statement, in which he had more information about what happened and why Chairman Blumenthal decided to use his power as chairman to hold this particular hearing.
The players admirably and heroically stood by the PGA Tour and said no to tens of millions of dollars. Likewise, members of the 9/11 families who are with us today stood by the PGA Tour. And others of us did the same. And then suddenly on June 6th, everything changed. The sports world was shocked by the announcement that the PGA Tour was entering into an agreement to combine forces with the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund, the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, which owns LIV Golf. It's an instrument of the Saudi government. And the deal was not to just take over a team, but the entire sport, not just an individual Saudi investor, but the government of Saudi Arabia. We've learned from the documents some facts that also indicate that the PGA Tour will be dominated in this agreement. We learned that after rebuffing the PIF as recently as January, the PGA Tour representative reached out to PIF Governor Yasir Al-Rumayyan days after he was told of fears that, quote, the Saudis will double down on their investment, end quote, in LIV. We learned that Saudi Arabia's early vision for the tour included a team golf tournament culminating in Saudi Arabia, at least one high-profile PGA event in Saudi Arabia, and a global golf investment fund managed by the PIF. We learned that just one night before the framework agreement between the PIF and the PGA Tour was signed, the PIF added a non-disparagement clause that appears to prevent the PGA Tour from criticizing Saudi Arabia and applies to the witnesses that are before us apparently today. We learned that Governor Al-Rumayyan will not only become the chairman of the PGA Tour's board, but he will sit on the executive committee of the new company that is to be formed, where he will, and this is a direct quote from a document we received, quote, provide PIF with strong influence over the new company.
And so those are the reasons that Chairman Blumenthal is apparently concerned enough to hold a hearing about a deal between two competing golf tours. He's clearly super focused on Saudi Arabia's public investment fund's role in professional golf. And so here are the witnesses that decided to show up to the hearing, because a few people involved with the LIV Tour were invited to testify but couldn't make it. And Chairman Blumenthal is promising a follow-up hearing with them whenever they can make that happen. But these are the guys that we'll be hearing from today.
The PGA Tour Chief Operating Officer Ron Price and board member Jimmy Dunn, who are with us today, played a central role in arranging the agreement.
And here's the first of 5 main lines of inquiry that Chairman Blumenthal had for these witnesses.
What happened that led the PGA Tour to change its position? Was it only the hope of ending litigation? Or was it also the unspecified in amount Saudi investment that would come of it?
And so to answer that question, here is a long montage of the PGA side of what happened and what the agreement they made with LIV Golf in June actually does. And so first, you're going to hear again from the PGA's Chief Operating Officer, Ron Price. And then you're going to hear from a member of the PGA's board, a dude with a Joe Pesci vibe named Jimmy Dunn. And he's the guy who actually conducted the secret negotiations with the owner of the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund, which in these hearings, they're going to refer to the fund as PIF. And in this testimony sequence, you'll also hear some questions posed by, in this order, Senator Ron Johnson of Ohio, Senator Roger Marshall of Kansas, and then we'll go back to Chairman Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut. But starting us off, here is the PGA's COO, Ron Price.
I serve as the Chief Operating Officer of the tour and most recently have been co-leading the tour while Commissioner Monahan is on medical leave. Let me start by saying that our goal is to protect an American institution that, along with its tournaments, generates over $200 million annually for over 3,000 charities across 34 states and brings the highest level of sports and entertainment to millions of fans around the globe and provides the most pro-competitive, legacy-driven platform for the world's best players. That goal, which is our core mission, has been under threat for the better part of 2 years. When the Saudi-funded LIV Golf Tour launched its inaugural series in 2022, the tour faced an unprecedented attack. In defending our organization and its regulations that each member agrees to at the start of every season, we were forced to suspend players, those players who made the choice to play for LIV Golf. They could play for the new league, but they could not come back and forth to free ride off the work and platform of the collective membership they left behind. In August 2022, we were sued in an effort to invalidate our regulations. This created a fracture in golf unlike anything our sport had experienced in decades and created a division in our closely knit membership organization.
My name is Jimmy Dunn, and since January of this year, I have served as an independent director on the PGA Tour Policy Board. We need to act from a position of strength, and we found ourselves in that position in the spring of this year. By April, major court rulings had set back LIV in its litigation against both the Tour and Europe's DP World Tour.
Now, the setback he's referring to was that the judge ruled that the Saudi Arabian Private Investment Fund would have had to reveal information about its financial business as part of the discovery process, just like the PGA would if the antitrust lawsuit went forward. And the Private Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia apparently did not want to open its kimono and reveal its goods to the world. And so back to PGA board member Jimmy Dunn.
It was the right moment to reach out, not only because of those legal victories, but also because of our solid financial condition. We knew that a long-term fight with LIV would be harmful to the players, fans, sponsors, and charities. We wanted to begin the negotiation while we were in a strong position. This would allow us to focus on uniting the game or walk away if that objective was not being served. At the direction of the PGA Tour Commissioner and the board chairman, I contacted Yasser Al-Rahman, LIV's majority owner and governor of the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia. A limited number of in-person meetings followed, and these meetings resulted in the framework agreement of May 30th. As members of this subcommittee know, some agreements are just mutual promises to continue to negotiate, and this describes the framework agreement. The only deal reached in the framework is that the lawsuits among the parties have been settled. Everything else is aspirational, and the rollout was very misleading and inaccurate, which is everyone's fault. There is no merger. There is no deal. There is simply an agreement to try to get to an agreement and settle the lawsuits. Understandably, the players were shocked. The real problem was the initial announcement. What should have been said is LIV and the PGA Tour have agreed to settle their lawsuits. They're terminated with prejudice, so we win those cases. And they agree to have discussions where PIF could be an investor, a minority investor in potentially an ongoing entity. That would have been great.
It was very clear to us and to all who love the PGA Tour and the game of golf as a whole that the dispute was undermining growth of our sport and was threatening the very survival of the PGA Tour.
The PGA Tour it's not that big in terms of players. So if they take 5 players a year, in 5 years, they can gut us.
Our business model is predicated on media revenues and sponsorship revenues, and that drives over 80% of our gross revenues. We have some other form of revenues, admissions, hospitalities, tournaments, licensing revenues, our tournament players clubs, but it's primarily predicated on media and sponsorship.
And by the way, the same media could pay for viewership rights for the other tours.
Correct.
Right?
Yes.
And they do to a certain extent, but not at the level that the PGA Tour garners.
That's correct. And, and they're trusting us when they enter into those agreements that we're going to deliver, an excellent field of players to them, and it's going to include our top players or a strong representation of our top players. And so we've had some loyal players. We've had a strong group of loyal players that have remained with us, and we're very proud of that. And as we talked about earlier, we're going to make sure those players are recognized. But if LIV stays in existence and continues to take our top players from us, that will put pressure on our ability to retain those media revenues and those sponsorship revenues. They could decline in the future if LIV said that is the existential threat. The focus was on LIV and what they were doing to try to recruit our players.
And they're your players.
Yes. Well, they're former PGA Tour members, and so they were our players before they left to go join LIV.
Okay. Are they contractors for you all? Do they work for you all?
They are independent contractors, so they can. They don't have to play in all of our events, but our regulations, stipulate that they can't play for a competing league unless they get a conflicting event release. These players did not. These are regulations. We're a membership organization. Those are regulations that were developed by the members themselves. And so they're free to go pay for another league. They just can't go back and forth.
Okay, thank
you. We were undergoing an investigation with regard to our regulations and how they applied to the players that we had suspended who joined the LIV Golf League. We have been notified that the antitrust regulators are also going to look at our framework agreement. We plan to fully cooperate with that investigation. Instead of losing control of the PGA Tour, we pursued a peace that would not only end the divisive litigation battles, but would also maintain the PGA Tour's structure, mission, and longstanding support for charity. While negotiations toward a definitive agreement are currently underway, the framework agreement contains important safeguards that ensures the tour will operate fundamentally as it does today. The tour will control its operations. The tour will control the board of the new PGA Tour subsidiary, and the tour will be the governing body for competitive golf in connection with any combined golf operations. The agreement provides clear, explicit, and permanent safeguards that ensure the tour will lead the decisions that shape our future and that we will have control over our operations, strategy, and continuity of our mission.
What are the other side agreements or informal understandings?
I'm not aware of any other side agreements or informal understandings.
Is that because you're not permitted to talk about them, or because there are none absolutely?
None exist to my knowledge.
And so now let's go back to the guy that negotiated the agreement with the Saudi Arabian head of the Public Investment Fund, Jimmy Dunn. This is the guy that reached out to the Saudis. He made that decision. And in this clip sequence, you will hear Jimmy Joe Pesci Dunn answer questions from Chair Richard Blumenthal, and then you're going to hear some reactions to these exchanges from Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky and then Senator Ron Johnson of Ohio.
Of course, we expect many questions about who we're dealing with. The reality is that because some men from Saudi Arabia were part of the nightmare of September 11th, suspicion has lingered about the complicity of others. For my part, my thoughts turn to September 11th. I remember the 66 friends and colleagues at my firm who died that morning, along with so many others when the towers went down. I think about them all the time. I think about the families, and I think about the grief that never ends. If any person had the remotest connection to an attack on our country and the murder of my friends, I am the last guy that would be sitting at a table with them.
The 9/11 families, a number of them are here today, and they've asked for a meeting with you. Would you commit to meet with them?
Yes.
And do you have anything maybe that you want to say to them now, as long as a number of them are here?
Senator, I will say now what I said on September 12th of 01, what I said to my children growing up. Anyone remotely involved, anyone tangentially involved, anyone who profited, anyone who was involved, we should pursue them with extreme prejudice to the full extent, to the complete capacity. And over the years, I want to thank President Bush. I want to thank President Obama. I want to thank the magnificent United States military. I want to thank the special services that have executed that with prejudice. I honestly believe that our government, with both President Bush, President Obama, our military, and the brilliant SEALs, did their job. And anyone that is involved with that thing has answered justice. I'd go on to say that with my own children, I thought it's been incredibly important to them to understand that because someone has the same skin color or the same religion as the people that were involved in the criminals that were involved in 9/11, that doesn't mean we hate them. That we're raised in the United States of America that has different values, and we look at things differently. And when I grew up, in our house, we had a sign, "No Irish need apply." And that was something my mother instilled us so that we just had a taste of what was that like when, because of religion or heritage, you didn't get something that you deserved. And I'm very proud that a friend of mine once said that my second son said that he had never ever heard me say one negative remark about any Middle Eastern, any Muslim religion, anything like that. And I'm very proud of that. I think America stands for something different. I think if someone does a crime, you go after him. For this crime, it's death. I absolutely I believe that our special services did their job. and I'm grateful to them, but I will refuse to describe a whole nother people because they had common religion or skin color. I'm not doing that under any condition.
If members of the Senate wanted to express their outrage over Saudi Arabia in a meaningful way, I gave them an opportunity to do so. In December 2021, I proposed canceling $650 million sale of 280 advanced air-to-air missiles and 596 missile launchers to Saudi Arabia. But there was no congressional hearing. We're here today talking about golf, but we didn't have one congressional hearing over sending hundreds of millions of dollars of advanced weapons to Saudi Arabia. There was no expression of outrage. Instead, 67 senators voted against my proposal and voted to continue selling arms to Saudi Arabia. It's time that Congress rediscovers the presumption of liberty, that our first recourse is to defend the unenumerated rights of private actors, not to expand our few and defined powers to regulate anything we may personally dislike. As a member of this institution, I find no grounds for government to be involved in the game of golf. But are there legitimate questions? Could we have legitimate hearings? Are there things we should be discussing? Of course. Do the 9/11 victims have a legal obligation owed to them by the Saudi Arabian government? It's a real question. Should we be involved with selling arms to Saudi Arabia? A real question. Should be debated, and we should have votes on these things. Should we be involved in the war in Yemen? Nobody in Congress ever voted to go in war in Yemen. Why the hell are we involved in that war?
But it would be grossly unfair to expect the PGA Tour to bear the full burden of holding Saudi Arabia accountable. After all, anyone who drives a car or uses oil-based products has helped fill the coffers of the Saudi Public Investment Fund. Foreign investment in the U.S. is generally a good thing, and I'd rather have the Saudis reinvest their oil wealth in America as opposed to China or Russia. Also, if the kingdom's involvement in golf and other sports helps it to modernize and offer more rights to women, wouldn't that be a good thing?
And I think he has a point, because in a way, the Saudis are spending our money that us fossil fuel addicts here in the United States have been funneling to them for decades for their oil. The oil is why they are our allies. The oil is why the Saudis have $700 billion in the fund, which they've used to create 84 companies in 13 sectors, including sports. And speaking of their sports investment, here's the next question that Chairman Blumenthal had about the PGA/LIV not a deal. This is the money question.
Just how much money did PIF offer the PGA Tour? And what other sources of money were sought as an alternative? What are the current assets of the PGA Tour?
Our total assets are approximately $3 billion.
And
net assets, the Senator Johnson referenced earlier, $1.3 billion.
I'm sorry, which figure is correct?
Net. The gross assets, approximately $3 billion. Net assets, Senator Johnson referenced earlier, are approximately $1.3 billion.
I have a breakdown for 2021 of the PGA's revenue. Maybe we can put that chart up. The PGA Tour brought in over $1.5 billion in revenue in 2021. Less than 3% of it, $43,694,020 was expensed as charitable grants. I don't mean to minimize that amount. It's a lot of money. But my question is, where did the rest of it go?
The rest of our revenue would have been in the cost to produce the revenue, and our largest cost is what we pay our players who compete for prize money through our tournaments.
How much of that money went to players?
And I'd have to check in 2021. I can tell you in 2023, we will distribute almost $1 billion to our players.
Out of how much revenue?
Our gross revenues in 2023 are approximately $2.1 billion.
And would it be fair to say that the remainder of that amount goes to produce the tournaments?
It's the cost of producing the tournaments. It's the cost of generating the revenues. There is charity distributed also. And if I could add, Senator, just for clarification, we are a 501c6 membership or trade association. Our mission is to generate economic opportunities for our players, but we have voluntarily structured our tournaments in a way so that the net proceeds of our tournaments go to charity. So in addition to what you had on that chart, there are tournaments who are given their net proceeds to tournaments because we partner with 501c3 organizations. That's how we generated over $215 million for charity last year and over $3.6 billion cumulatively.
And you own a number of the tournaments, like the Travelers in Connecticut you own, correct?
No, sir. We partner with a 501c3 organization who conducts that tournament.
You partner with them, but who owns the tournament?
We conduct the competition, but the local charity organization that we work with in Hartford sells the tickets, the hospitality, and sponsorship, and the net proceeds they generate, which are annually, I think, in the approximately $2 million, goes back to charity in the local Hartford community.
If this litigation is ended and your revenue is almost $3 billion a year, why do you need the Saudis $1 billion?
We did not seek the Saudis. We were in a situation of where we faced a real threat of.
But you could go elsewhere for $1 billion, $3 billion, maybe $50 billion, correct?
We could, but if we went down that path, we would end up giving up total control of the PGA Tour. And this particular situation, not only did we preserve the Tour's future leadership of professional golf.
You could insist on the same requirements for independence of the Tour that you are insisting on, you say, from the Saudis.
We could potentially try that approach, but we would still face the threat of a $700 billion fund recruiting our players and operating a league in an irrational economic manner.
And so you decided to take the financing and the investment from Saudi Arabia for this new entity that would also incorporate the PGA Tour, correct?
Senator, we have not taken any funding. All we've done is settle the litigation and enter into a framework agreement in which the PGA Tour will be the clear leader of professional golf going
But there
forward.
is an understanding that PIF will contribute an investment to the PGA Tour and the entity that will control it.
They will not be contributing to the PGA Tour. It will be a PGA Tour controlled subsidiary. And any funding...
What is the amount of the Saudi investment that is going to be made?
That has not been determined yet, Senator.
Has there been any discussion of what that amount will be?
It would be, there's been discussions, it would be a significant amount. What
are the amounts that have been discussed?
North of $1 billion.
And are there possibilities that additional amounts would be contributed?
That's in the complete control of the PGA Tour because it's a PGA Tour subsidiary. And the board's controlled by the PGA Tour, and they have absolute control over how much funding they accept now and in the future.
Instead of accepting this amount of money, call it an investment, call it financing, from the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, did you explore other sources of potential investment?
We considered that, Senator, but had we gone down that path, we would still be fighting the very expensive and disruptive litigation.
And if you had won, you would have prevailed.
That was far from a certainty, and LIV Golf would have continued to recruit our players and put our tour at jeopardy, and they could have become the leader of professional golf and operated it for the benefit of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
What other sources of funding did you explore?
We did not have specific conversations with any outside firm, but we talked about it as potential and what those terms might be.
What conversations among yourselves did you have as to the alternative sources of funding?
We've talked about it at board meetings, a structure similar to what we've set up. We decided to not pursue it at any point in time because we'd still be in litigation and still be fighting the Public Investment Fund, which has $700 billion of assets.
Tomorrow, you could go through an IPO, you could go to private equity funders, you could go to the players if they wanted to own as well as be members of the PGA Tour, you have a lot of options right now, correct?
Senator, if we chose one of those options, we would still be facing a real threat that LIV Golf and the $700 billion public investment fund would continue to recruit our top players.
But Mr. Price, players have stood by you. Mr. Dunn himself, and I want to hold up this quote, which I think is so powerful, talking about Tiger Woods and the offer of $700 million. It takes a lot to say no to a bucket full of money. These players who stood by you are heroes. They deserve our thanks. And I am betting, because I never want to bet against America, that America will be on your side, thick or thin. Do you agree, Mr. Dunn?
Senator, it's an excellent line of questioning, and thank you for raising it. We're contractually obligated to try to see if we can come to a deal that makes sense. We'll meet all our obligations. As Senator Johnson and Senator Marshall have pointed out, that when it's in this massive transparency, it will make things difficult. If it ends up we don't get to an agreement, which is possible, LIV Golf will still be there. They'll still have a lot of money, and we'll have to do all the things you're talking about.
So you still have the choice to stand up against sports washing, against the Saudi monarchy, against the hundreds of billions of dollars, and maybe a lot more that the Saudis will throw at you, and stand up for America, because America's going to stand up for you, and maybe you're contractually bound to give it your best efforts to reach an agreement.
Yeah.
But there is something that stinks about this path that you're on right now, because it is a surrender, and it is all about the money, and that's the reason for the backlash that you've seen, Mr. Price.
Chairman Blumenthal clearly didn't get it. Because to have the ability to compete on the same financial level with LIV Golf, the PGA would need $700 billion at their disposal. The PGA has 3. And all of the top players would have to choose the PGA, which they've already proven they would not do. Phil Mickelson took the bucket full of money offered to him by the Saudis' public investment fund. And he's one of the 2 golfers whose names I know. The other golfer I've heard of is Tiger Woods, and he didn't take the LIV Tour money. And so half of the golfers that I've heard of chose to go on the Saudi-sponsored Happy Gilmore Tour. But that said, I really don't buy that the LIV Tour is an existential threat to the PGA. The PGA could still exist if LIV exists, but the PGA wouldn't remain a monopoly. And that's because for the first time in its history, there would be a competing tour with enough money to attract voluntarily top players. But that doesn't mean that the PGA couldn't exist. So for example, in another sport, I'm a huge fan of professional beach volleyball, and there are 2 professional tours that all of the professionals play on. One is the AVP, which is the American Tour, and the other is the FIVB Pro Beach World Tour. And the top players play on both tours. And because it does happen, when there are tournaments on the same weekend, the players simply have to choose which one they're going to play on. Just last weekend was the AVP Hermosa event. It's one of their most popular events. But none of the top women's teams were playing because they all chose to go to the FIVB Elite 16 World Tour event in Stade, Switzerland. And they did that because Stade is a tournament that helps them get into the Olympics. Now, in my opinion, the AVP was stupid for scheduling Hermosa on the same weekend as Stade. But the point is that both tour events were sellouts, and both tours are existing just fine at the same time. And so it's clearly possible for professional golfers to play on 2 tours as well, and for both tours to survive. The LIV Tour being a thing is not an existential threat to the PGA, but it is an existential threat to the PGA's monopoly. And that's why LIV sued the PGA for antitrust violations. LIV sued the PGA for being a monopoly and behaving like one. Because if the PGA didn't prevent players from playing on both tours, there could be a serious stuffy tour for charity and a Happy Gilmore tour funded by dictators with oil money. And players and golf lovers could choose which tours they want to participate in, attend, and watch. And my guess is that many would choose both, as I have with beach volleyball. But Chairman Blumenthal clearly didn't get it. You heard him. He seems to think that this agreement came about because the PGA is seeking $1 billion of Saudi money. And he seems to think that they can turn down the money out of some kind of loyalty to America. But that's not the situation here. But Senator Ron Johnson, I have to give him credit. He did seem to get it.
The PGA never would have sought additional funding. You didn't need it. The only reason you're looking for funding from the PIF is an accommodation for PIF to have a seat at the table in running golf. If you don't offer them that seat, they'll take their $700 billion, a portion of that, and they will keep picking off players one by one until they destroy the game of golf at the highest competitive level. I mean, Mr. Dunn, isn't that how you see it?
Thank you, Senator. It's very important that we didn't decide one day we'll go over to Riyadh and bring these guys in here.
No, you were highly reluctant to reach out to them.
We got to the table because of the existence of LIV. They own 100% of LIV. They have billions of dollars in LIV. They have no economic constraint. They have no time constraint. So when you deal with a normal investor, they want to return quickly. They have a long horizon. I don't exactly know all their thought process, but they view it differently. They sued us. We did not decide to sue them. They took our players. Their entire existence is based on taking more of our players.
Our players. You know, through this whole hearing, I kept noticing that it seems like the PGA executives think they own all the best players, even though they classify all the players as independent contractors, as in legally independent of the PGA. The LIV Tour was offering these independent players a lot more money. And in this regard, Chairman Blumenthal kind of has a point, because the PGA does have the option to raise more money in a lot of different ways and use that money to make the players better offers, competing offers. But instead, the PGA chose to try to kill the competition by punishing players who also wanted to play on the new tour. And so that leads us to another one of Chairman Blumenthal's main questions, because after the agreement, is the competition gonna die? And his question's going to be answered by the PGA's Chief Operating Officer, Ron Price.
And we don't know whether LIV will continue to exist after the conclusion of its next season. And if so, what form or under what leadership?
Under the framework agreement, if we are able to move to a definitive agreement and it's approved, the LIV Golf assets, for which Greg Norman is currently the commissioner, will move into a new subsidiary, PGA Tour subsidiary, controlled by the PGA Tour. And those events will be managed by the PGA Tour. We have a complete infrastructure in place to manage events. It would make no sense to bring in that type of an executive to manage what is now a 14 series of events.
So just to be clear, he's out of a job.
If we reach a definitive agreement, we would not have a requirement for that type of position.
So the end goal is for the PGA to eat the competition and maintain their monopoly over professional golf. And so if that happens, what do they intend to happen to the players? Here's Senator Alex Padilla of California questioning the Chief Operating Officer of the PGA, Ron Price.
For the new players that were now eligible to compete in the PGA, because there was a handful that left to LIV, what happens to them after this merger if it goes through?
Senator, we've got two task forces in place now, and we're working with our player directors because we're a membership organization. That's who we represent. And the first task force is evaluating ways in which we can recognize the players who remain loyal to the PGA Tour. That's very important to us. We will not move forward with a definitive agreement unless we get that right, and our players support that. For players who left the tour to play for LIV, they were suspended. If they come back, they're not going to be playing for LIV. They'll be playing for a PGA Tour controlled sports league or golf league. And they will have to go through our existing rules and regulations process to gain re-entry.
So the way I hear this, that sounds like the players that went to play for the LIV Tour, like Phil Mickelson, who's one of the greats. It sounds to me like he might have to go back into the qualifiers or do whatever newbies have to do to get back into the PGA tournaments. Because the PGA banned the LIV players, including Mickelson, from playing in PGA tournaments. And so they obviously couldn't get credits for playing in those tournaments as they were prohibited from earning points for the last 2 seasons. And I mean, who knows how this will actually shake out, but it does sound like there will be punishments or at least hurdles of some sort for those players that played on the LIV Tour. And while we're on the topic of players, here's Chairman Richard Blumenthal's next main question about the parts of the agreement that he says would prohibit PGA members and players from talking shit on Saudi Arabia. And his questions are going to be answered first by the Chief Operating Officer of the PGA, Ron Price, and then we'll go over to the PGA board member, Jimmy Dunn, who negotiated this whole agreement.
We also don't know what will happen to players who may want to speak out against Saudi Arabia's human rights abuses. They apparently are bound by the non-disparagement clause. The LIV Golf tournament had requirements about wearing apparel. Are they going to have Saudi insignia on their shirts? Are they going to be speaking on behalf of the Saudi government? Are you bound by the non-disparagement clause that is very specifically stated in the agreement?
Not in this forum, Senator.
Not in this forum, but generally?
Generally, when you're negotiating a business agreement, it's common to have a non-disparagement clause so that you
it may be common, Mr. Price, but you are bound by it. And Mr. Dunn, as a member of the policy board and a party to these negotiations, you are bound by it as well, correct?
Senator, I'm sitting before United States senators. You can ask me what you want, and I will answer it truthfully.
I'm not questioning that you will give us what you believe is the true as to facts. But my understanding of this clause, and you're right, Mr. Price, it is very common to business agreements, is that it would be binding on you, on other members of the policy board, potentially on the athletes. Indeed, the LIV requirements for their players have a similar bar to any of them saying anything negative about any relevant person, including members of the PIF governing apparatus. I'm going to end my questioning now, but for this round, but I would like to have a commitment from both of you that the final agreement will not prevent players or PGA Tour executives from commenting on or criticizing actions of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Will you make that commitment?
That will certainly be an objective we would seek, Senator, and I would add that the framework agreement does not prevent our players from speaking their mind on any matters. They're open.
It doesn't now, but you can't commit that the final agreement will not require them to avoid any such disparaging statement?
We do not anticipate it having that.
You don't anticipate it? Will you commit that it won't have it, that you will not agree to it if it does?
I wouldn't recommend it to the policy board for approval if it's
done.
As I'm not doing the negotiation, but as Ron just said, he wouldn't recommend it. I will inform the entire board of your excellent point, and it won't. I'll guarantee you the board will vote on it. I don't have the power to decide that, but we hear you, we understand, and I'll advocate for it. If we get to an agreement, and that disparagement that is basically to the term of the agreement. So you generally don't want to be saying bad things about each other when you're negotiating, but it has a short-term life on it till we get to a definitive.
And then finally, there was one other theme in this hearing about Saudi Arabia possibly investing in and gaining some measure of influence over the PGA Tour. And this was a theme obsessed over by Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri in particular during both of his question rounds. And so here are his questions posed to the chief operating officer of the PGA, Ron Price.
Let's talk about some of the money that you've taken from communist China. Speaking of sports washing, what can you tell me, Mr. Price, about the PGA Tour China Series?
Thank you, Senator. The PGA Tour China Series was last operated in 2019. We have not operated it since then and have no plans to continue that series.
You don't have a PGA Tour in China at all right now?
We do not.
What about the PGA China Tour? Let's look at the quote here from Mr. Greg Gilligan. PGA Tour China is truly thrilled to be partnering with Shanghai Sports on the PGA Tour Series China. Shanghai is a world-class organization with great experience of connecting the expectations of international sports bodies with an understanding of the Chinese market. This isn't happening.
I'm not sure, Senator, what the date on that quote is, but we have not conducted the PGA Tour China Series since 2019.
But you just signed a 20-year agreement to conduct a tour series in China, correct?
It has not been conducted since 2019.
Did you take $45 million in financing from the Yao Group to conduct PGA Tour China?
No, sir, we did not.
Okay, so you're telling me that you're not going to do any further business in China. You've got no contracts with any Chinese entities, and you're not going to operate PGA events in China.
We have no plans to continue that series at this point in time.
You're not going to operate any other series. You're not going to do anything in China. Do I understand you correctly?
We have no present plans to do that.
Does PGA Tour China, this entity that the tour owns, based in Beijing, for which you've signed a 20-year contract, does it still exist?
I can tell you two things. One is I would have to check the status of the contract. I do not believe it's currently in force, but I would have to check that. The second thing I can tell you is that we haven't operated since 2019, and it's my understanding that we have no plans to continue that series.
As long as COVID exists, or
period.
And why is that?
From a business standpoint, we're not going to continue that series in China.
And I'd like your assurances that your commitment that you're not going to restart this series in China and you're not going to conduct business operations with millions of dollars in financing from Chinese entities. Will you give me that commitment?
As I've stated, we have no intentions of continuing that series from my perspective. And I can't commit the tour for the long term. I'm not in a position to do that. But there's, nothing in the short term or immediate future that, from a tournament standpoint, that we're considering doing in China.
Did I miss a new law that made it illegal to do business in and or play golf in China? Because I get email notifications about all new laws, and I haven't seen one, so what is this? And in case you're wondering, this line of questioning was bipartisan. In fact, Chairman Blumenthal took it even further.
Will you commit that you will have no PGA Tour events in China going forward?
Senator, I'm not in a position to commit the tour indefinitely, but we do not have anything planned for the foreseeable future.
That'll depend on what the new entity, the new co, decides.
The PGA Tour will have full control over that entity, and it will determine its schedule and where our tournaments are located, or otherwise we will not recommend approval of the definitive agreement.
Will you commit to have no PGA Tour events in Russia?
Senator, I can't commit the PGA Tour for the long term, but we certainly do not have any plans to conduct any events in Russia.
What do China and Russia have to do with any of this? This just doesn't seem like an appropriate request from members of Congress to me, and apparently to Senator Ron Johnson as well.
Let me first state, Mr. Chairman, I just don't think it's appropriate to be asking these representatives of the PGA to make assurances in terms of what they will and will not do. Obviously, they have to assure us that they'll follow the law. but exactly how they operate, they're a private organization. They have to deal with a complex set of issues in terms of running a league for the benefit of their players and, I would say, for fans.
And while we're on the subject of requests from Congress that seem to be inappropriate, here's Chair Blumenthal again at the end of the hearing.
My hope is that you will resist those bucketful of money. I think a lot of players, a lot of sponsors, a lot of charities, and frankly, the 9/11 families are hoping that the PGA Tour will stand up and frankly avoid the sellout that this deal seems to be.
So he wants the PGA to stand up to Saudi Arabia, while Congress won't. While Congress continues to allow weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, while Congress does nothing to push Saudi Arabia to end the blockade that is prohibiting food and fuel from getting into Yemen, while Congress continues to hold 0 investigative hearings into Saudi Arabia's role in 9/11, Congress does nothing to address the core issues that we have with Saudi Arabia's historical and present use of violence. But a golf tour is getting shamed by members of Congress into taking a stand. The hypocrisy is stunning, if not at all surprising. But big picture, Congress, at least in my opinion, doesn't seem to have any business investigating this deal at this point in time. There was not one time in this hearing during which a compelling case was made for how in the world Saudi Arabia investing in a golf tour poses any danger to the American public, as a threat to national security would imply that it is. Because even if the Saudi Arabians got full control of the PGA Tour, what danger does that pose to me? Golf is a game. It doesn't even have to exist at all for each of us to have wonderful lives. In fact, personally, my life would be greatly improved if my husband wasn't constantly blowing our money on hitting little balls into gopher holes. I don't mind if the game disappears, because golf is not one of life's necessities. And so if the Saudis control a golfing tour, I am struggling to feel the danger. The only area where Congress does seem to have a role here, if the agreement is ratified, that is in terms of the tax status of the PGA Tour, because the agreement says that there would be a new branch of the PGA Tour that would be for profit. And so here's Chairman Blumenthal explaining his concern about that.
We don't know what assets the PGA Tour will place in the new entity or how it will maintain its nonprofit status. Certainly a profoundly important question. What assets it gained while it had nonprofit status that may be transferred now to a for-profit entity, raising very serious questions that ought to concern this committee and the Congress, especially since it has indicated that there will be an active commercial role for this new entity. PGA Tour also derives tremendous benefits from tax laws established by Congress because it operates as a 501c6 not-for-profit entity, and that provision of law has received little scrutiny. This inquiry may lead to close scrutiny of 501c6. A study conducted in 2013 found that this benefit was worth at least $200 million to the tour between 1993 and 2013.
Nice tax breaks you've enjoyed there, PGA. So kind of us to allow you to keep that $200 million. Would be a shame if we in Congress took those tax breaks away from you. You know, saying this in the same hearing in which Chairman Blumenthal basically accused the PGA of being disloyal to the United States, questioning how the PGA will maintain its nonprofit status, while also requesting that the PGA purposefully blow up their deal with the LIV Tour during the upcoming negotiations. Does that sound at all like a threat to the PGA to you? You know, not that I think it's a very powerful threat, because by making a deal with the LIV Tour, the PGA would maintain their monopoly over the rich man's sport, which I have to imagine is more valuable than $200 million in tax breaks spread out over 20 years. But that's the thing that I think really needs to be highlighted here, that in this hearing really just wasn't. And that's the monopoly. The agreement was made to kill a lawsuit that challenged the PGA's monopoly behaviors, that challenged the PGA's attempts to kill a competing tour by starving it of players who would probably play on both tours if that was allowed by the PGA. The agreement was made to maintain the PGA's monopoly status over the sport and over the players, the independent contractor players, the not employees of the PGA, who should be, as independents, realistically able to play golf in any tournament that they please. The PGA pulled monopoly and got sued. And if a PGA LIV merger does happen, as you heard, a big if that can be prevented, well, they will maintain their power to keep pulling monopoly And isn't that the fundamental issue here? You know, the focus of this hearing was on the Saudi Arabians. But how have the Saudi Arabians hurt the players by creating a Happy Gilmore tour and showering them with cash to play on it? However, the players have been demonstrably harmed by the PGA ban on participation in the PGA Tour for anyone who plays on the LIV Tour, hence the lawsuits. You know, it could be anyone with billions to spare who started the LIV Tour. The PGA didn't ban the players because it was owned by the Saudis. They banned the players because they were playing for the competition. The threat is to the monopoly, and the deal would maintain the monopoly. And on the issue of the monopoly, our senators seemed disturbingly unconcerned. So I'm aware that some people are going to be surprised to find this episode pop up in their podcast feed this weekend. And that is because of We're Not Wrong. And I've gotten some very, very kind messages and some Venmo payments, which I really appreciate, from people who heard my mental breakdown at the end of the last episode of We're Not Wrong. Because basically Justin asked me, what's up next for Congressional Dish? And I told him that I wasn't working this week. I had taken last week off. And when it came to coming back this week, I just couldn't do it. I was feeling quite mental. And so my mom is here visiting me in Mexico City. So I was going to take another week off and just try and feel better. And so as I'm explaining this to the boys, I friggin' cried because the reason that I've identified that I didn't want to come back to work is because this Congress is awful. And I'm sick of paying attention to it to the extent that I am. And yeah, so I cried and and that was embarrassing. And so if you want to hear it, go and check out that episode of We're Not Wrong, because I'm not trying to spread my instability any further. I'm not going to play it for you here, but that happened. And that recording was on Wednesday. Well, the next day I was supposed to take my mother to a castle, but she wasn't feeling particularly well. She's totally fine, but I think she just needed a day of rest. And so while she was resting, Claire, my amazing assistant who is helping me keep an eye on Congress, she is simply the best. She had sent me a message in our Slack telling me about this hearing. And she said, I think you might be interested in this. And obviously, like I said in the episode, my husband, Joe, likes golf. And so I knew he'd be interested in it. And so I watched the hearing and I was kind of doing it just for funsies. And as I was watching, I was just kind of making edits and playing with my notes. And at the end of it, I realized I had so many notes in this file that I had an episode. And so I decided to make one. And what I'm really excited about is I had so much fun making this episode. So I'm feeling so much better. I know that I could have taken the rest of the week off, but I didn't feel pressured to do this. I had already told people that I wasn't going to prepare an episode. And yet my feeling of love for this production came back, even though this episode is a perfect example of what I was crying about, that this Congress isn't doing anything about all of the fixable problems that we have in this country. It seems like this Congress wants to only do the easy stuff because it's politically easier for sure to investigate a Gulf deal than investigate 9/11 or the war in Yemen or weapons deals or any of the other issues that could lead to revelations that might make, the presidents of their own political parties or they themselves look bad. So they're only doing the easy stuff if they're doing anything at all. And it's very frustrating for me. It's so hard to know the good that Congress could do and watch a Congress that's full of cowards. But, this hearing was still interesting as evidenced by the fact that there wasn't an empty seat in that room. And so I thought maybe it'd be interesting to you. And so here's your episode. But I know that the structure of this episode was different. It was a lot less me. And I think we had a stretch there of about 13 minutes of nothing but Congress. And I'm curious to hear from producers, quite frankly, what you guys think about the value of these episodes. Because what I like about it is it's a summary of a very long hearing that's not going to take you as long. And I love the actual act of taking the storylines and putting them together and creating these montages. Like it's an art for me. And if you enjoy that art, I would like to do more episodes like this, but I know it's a different structure. And I actually know we've done episodes like this before. So I know that a lot of people have told me that you're into it, but I guess I need to hear it again if that's the case. And so producers, if you could go, so if you're a Patreon producer, if you could go into the comments on this episode and let me know what you think. And then if you're someone that just sends in payments once in a while, if you could put in the comments of your Venmo and Cash App payments or your PayPal payments, however you want to send it in, I would really like to hear from the people who are investing in this show if you feel like your investments are well served by episodes that are structured like this. And thank you in advance for supporting the show and for supporting me, even when I'm being a nut. And before we wrap up this episode, I also want to give a very special thank you to all of our executive producers. I'm really loving having the automatically adjusting most valuable episodes of Congressional Dish on the Congressional Dish website. And the way that it gets adjusted are the executive producer credits. You guys are telling the new people which episodes you find the most valuable. And so Garrick Smalley has decided to do this for episode 276, The Demise of Dollar Dominance, which makes me feel really good because that episode got very little financial love. And I don't know if it was because the episode wasn't good or because I didn't put a explanation of the value for value funding model in the beginning. So, we did that experiment for one episode and we got some Venmo payments come in, but it was the exact opposite for this last episode. So, this is exactly what I keep saying. So yeah, the payments didn't come in. I don't know why. And so it really does feel good to have an EP credit on that episode because I think the dominance of the dollar on the global, not scale, but on the global stage, the dominance of the dollar. I think it's an important issue. And I found that to be an interesting hearing. And so what Garrick said about it, he said, "Hey, Jen, I think I have about 4 producer credits available and I'd like to use one of them for this episode. Just to go a bit tinfoil hat on you, I wonder if one of the reasons we have not been doing more with renewable energy is because oil is the currency of the world's economy and all trading for oil is done in dollars. If every nation started using renewables, they would not be as dependent on the US as we would lose one of our levers of power. I hope you're enjoying Mexico. Be well." I don't think that's tinfoil hat at all, Garrick. I think that is definitely a part of it because they actually name the dollar the petrodollar. It's referred to that way quite often. Excellent point. I probably should have made it in the episode, but thank you for putting one of your EP requests on that episode. I'm very happy to know that it was valuable to you because I personally found it valuable, and it's nice to know I'm not alone. Okay. So like I said, I'm feeling a lot better. I have a renewed hope for my ability to do this show without losing my mind. And I do have a few episodes coming up for you. So I'm going to do an episode on the censure of Adam Schiff. That actually did make it through the House. He was officially censured. And so we'll look into why did he do the things he was accused of? And what does it matter if you're censured? So that episode is coming up next. I also watched a really interesting hearing about junk fees. So eventually we'll have an episode about that. And then I'm going to take the advice of my wonderful friends and co-hosts, Justin Robert Young and Andrew Heaton. I don't know if it made it onto the We're Not Wrong Patreon episode or not, but they did give me some podcasting therapy. And their advice is, if this Congress isn't doing anything, go back to the Congresses that did and look into those investigations. And the last Congress, I do feel like some of my frustration is the yo-yo effect of really liking the last Congress. There were great investigations. There were some excellent laws that came out of that Congress. Although now that I say that, there was excellent law. I liked the Inflation Reduction Act. That was a lot, but that's so rare for me to see a law that I'm excited about, you know? So I went from that Congress to the opposite extreme of this one. I've been really struggling with that. But because the last Congress had so many things going on, there was an entire antitrust investigation that had, Claire did the list. We have at least 7 or 8 hearings with the antitrust investigation that was conducted, which was apparently excellent. They came out with a 400-page report. It was a huge investigation. And I want to look into that because just like we saw in this episode, we have an issue with monopolies in the United States, and it goes far beyond sports. And so I want to watch those hearings. They never got around to it, and this Congress keeps dicking around. So let's go back to the really interesting things. And then Claire, I'm going to do this because we've been talking about it for years, but Claire and I are also looking into the issue of PFAS chemicals, which are essentially forever chemicals. She sent me an article, I think it was NPR, but she sent me an article that was basically saying that they did water tests and there are these forever chemicals in about half of our drinking water. So they're kind of a big deal. I've seen legislation passed into law, usually attached to defense authorizations that have to do with these PFAS chemicals. And there's been a bunch of hearings going back, I want to say a couple Congresses now. And so that's another project that I want to dive into. And what I'm kind of thinking of doing, because, you know, the antitrust hearings, like I said, there's like 8 of them. And then there's all these different PFAS ones. Instead of jamming them all into one episode, should I make it a series and have, you know, a bunch of episodes about these things so we really understand the issue? Because I think antitrust and chemicals in our water, I think those are pretty big deals. And I don't really want to skim over a lot of that information. And so that's why I'm really looking at the feedback of, do you like these episodes where you're hearing the summaries of the hearings and not a lot of me? Because I could pump out a lot of these while working on these projects and then do a big summary episode at the end of it. But I don't know. Is that what you want? Is that a good idea? I don't know. I'm at a crossroads again with this show. Like, how do I keep doing it and making it valuable for you while not losing my mind? And also to do these episodes where I'm listening to, you know, 8 different hearings and reading a 400-page report, to do that properly, I can't do that in 2 weeks. So the other thing I'm thinking is, like, do you want to hear some episodes about the work as I do it, or do you only want the end of my own investigation? But in order to do that and to not lose my mind, I might have to produce fewer episodes. So that's kind of like all the madness going on in my head. It's a more productive madness than what you heard at the end of that We're Not Wrong episode. I'm feeling inspired by it because at least now I'm seeing a couple paths forward that I wasn't seeing when I talked to the boys on Wednesday. So again, thank you for all your messages. This show is not in any danger of disappearing. And for now, my mind is intact. So yeah, thanks again for supporting the show. And I will be back, I think, by the end of July, you will have your episode about the censure of Adam Schiff. All right, talk to you later. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, in the end he'll justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The
polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.